Welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Today's episode is one I've really been looking forward to. My guest is Espen Stabell, a philosopher at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences and the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Espen is also my PhD supervisor. I don't have a strong background in philosophy. My research up till now has been more in environmental impact assessment, but when I started following the deep sea mining debate, it struck me that the ethical questions were some of the most central and the most contested. So I got interested in how we decide what we should do once we know what we can do, and maybe more importantly, how we make decisions when uncertainty is still unresolved. I asked around, and everyone I spoke to pointed me towards Espen, who did his doctorate on the ethics of deep sea mining and environmental ethics more broadly. In this conversation, Espen helps lay out some of the groundwork for moral philosophy, where environmental ethics comes from, how it differs from other ways of studying values, and why these distinctions matter. I wanted to have this conversation with Espen to help people who, like me, want to know what moral philosophy can contribute to the conversation around deep sea mining.
Some more reflexivity on the normative concepts would be good. So typically in papers about deep sea mining, when people are trying to make some sort of policy recommendations, they can assume things like how this will affect the intrinsic value of nature. That's a concept that pops up quite often. And also things like welfare, human welfare. But these are both concepts that are extremely complex and problematic from a philosophical perspective. There's no agreement at all about what the intrinsic value of nature, what that even means. And even like prima facie simple concept like welfare, like human welfare, is just, there's so much discussion and disagreement about what that means. It should be pretty obvious that there's at least a need for someone who can try to like clarify what these concepts mean and put some like content into them.
In the first half of this conversation, Espen lays out some of the sort of foundations around environmental philosophy, where it comes from and how it differs from other ways of studying values. In the second half, we dig deeper into how ethical reasoning connects to the real-world dilemmas in deep sea mining. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll find it fascinating. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Espen Stabell. Welcome, Espen, to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast.
Thank you.
It's actually going to be kind of interesting because I don't think I've ever asked you, despite that you've been supervising me now for almost 2 years on the topic of ethics in deep sea mining. I don't think I've ever asked you what you actually think about deep sea mining. So I don't know if we're going to get into that. But let's start with you. So where do you come from? And how did you get interested in moral philosophy? And then how did you get interested in the philosophy of deep sea mining? And why should people take anything you say seriously on the topic?
Wow. Start with the easy part. I'm from Oslo, Norway. That's where I was born, raised, did my master's in philosophy. I did my master's in environmental philosophy. So before that, I was already interested in moral philosophy, but at that time I was probably most interested in environmental questions. So ethical questions about environmental issues. Exciting, sort of one of the newer areas of ethics, applied ethics. So people haven't been thinking about the ethics of the environment for too long, at least in academic philosophy. I guess it started in the 70s to become like an academic field, environmental ethics, with a groundbreaking paper called Is there a need for a new environmental ethics or something?
By who?
It's by Richard Routley. It's weird I've forgotten the title, but we can look it up. But he introduced very famous thought experiment where he asks us to imagine that there is only one person left on Earth for some reason. Maybe it's been some sort of nuclear catastrophe or whatever reason, but there's one person left, and this person decides to just go berserk and just destroy as much as he can of the natural environment. And Richard Routley wanted us to consider whether he was doing something wrong. So the idea is that if we think he's doing something wrong, then it's a natural further question: who is he wronging? So why is it wrong? And if it is wrong, and since there's no people left, he's the only person left on the planet, and let's say that he just also disappears, dies or something immediately after. There's no people left facing or being harmed by the consequences of that absurd event. And but if we still think it's wrong, then that must mean, Routley said, that there's something about the destruction of the environment in itself that is wrong, even though it doesn't hurt people. So the ethics up until then, traditional ethics, had been about people. So what the point he wanted to make is that, well, if we think there's something wrong with what the last man does to nature, to his environment, to the non-human natural environment, then maybe we need some sort of new ethical thinking, new ideas, new concepts to sort of explain and capture why that action is wrong, if it's wrong, if we want to explain sort of that intuition that many people have that, well, there is something wrong going on in that type of act.
Well, I didn't know that this kind of whatever value of non-anthropocentric nature wasn't really a thing. I mean, I'm sure it was a thing, but it wasn't really a thing in moral philosophy before the 1970s. So it's a bit hard to imagine having grown up after that.
People had talked about the value of nature and animals. So Jeremy Bentham, for instance, I guess his utilitarianism was the first non-anthropocentric ethic, because he thought that what's morally bad is pain, and if animals can feel pain, that means we can harm them, we can wrong them, and they need to sort of be included into our moral universe. So it has had already, people had been thinking like that, and even Kant was thinking about the value of nature in a sense. Immanuel Kant, the famous 17th century philosopher. Jeremy Bentham was also a 17th century philosopher known for utilitarianism, the first utilitarian ethical theory. Kant was the first to develop a deontological theory. And Kant also talks about nature, the sublime. We get this feeling that there's some sort of what he calls something sublime about nature, which is not the same as the beauty of an object of art, but it's something similar. And he connected that to some sort of value, but it was still anthropocentric because it was a value just for us. He didn't think it had a value in itself. So these questions had been present in philosophy and ethics before Routley, but he was the one who he formulated this question in a very pointed way, and asked more explicitly, so do we need a new ethic, a new I think the paper is called "Is there a need for a new and environmental ethic?"
Okay.
So that's his question, and after that it became sort of established as a field. People started to respond to his paper, and the literature just started to grow. And parallel to that, things were happening. Routley was from Australia, things were happening in Germany with Hans Jonas, talking about our responsibility for nature. Arne Næss in Norway started talking about this. I think it was in the mid or late 70s. But I mean, around that time is when it really started to become an academic field, and I think most people would agree that Routley's paper was sort of a landmark event. Yeah.
Okay, so you're at this point in the story, you're a master's student interested in environmental philosophy, and it is a relatively new discipline in academic philosophy.
Yes, so that became a very long story about the emergence of environmental ethics. But to get back to my story, yes, I did my master's with Arne Johan Vetlesen, who was like the most well-known environmental philosopher in Norway at that time. And after that, after I did my master's, I was sort of not sure what I would do. I wanted to do philosophy, but I was also a little bit like small breaks. I did some sort of journalism stuff, working as a freelancer for a couple of years before I then decided, well, I want to try to do a PhD. And at that time, I think my interests had evolved more towards, I mean, Arne Johan Vetlesen and his sort of tradition is more continental philosophy, European thinkers, and that was also my perspective. But then there's this sort of divide in philosophy between the continental approaches and the more analytical approaches. Not sure whether we need to go into that, but my interest had evolved into more analytic philosophy, and that's a more recent, like the more recent developments in moral philosophy has happened in that tradition, and also in practical ethics, applied ethics. So yeah, but how did I get into this deep sea mining stuff? That was more coincidental, I think. So I saw this call for applications for a PhD position at NTNU, which was connected to deep sea mining. I didn't know anything about deep sea mining. I hadn't thought anything at all, I think, about the subsea, like what was happening in the oceans even. That wasn't something I thought about, but when I read that call, I became sort of interested in this for several reasons. First of all, is like, wow, I haven't even thought about like the ocean. The ocean is vast and it's super important to human welfare, and there's a lot of like nature going on there. But I had really thought about the ocean before, so that became like okay, this seems important. And then, of course, deep sea mining was an activity that would potentially do stuff in the ocean that would have environmental impacts and so on. So I thought, like, yeah, my interest in environmental ethics is super relevant to this position. So I applied.
So what year was this?
That was in 2014. So I got the position in 2015.
Wow, so that was really before there was any real conversation about deep sea mining in Norway.
Yeah, and that was some of what I found exciting about it, was that it was sort of like science fiction. It was the technology was starting to something had happened. Like they talked about deep sea mining also in the 90s, but then, as I understand it, but you're a historian that you have interviewed, know much more about this, but there was interest in it in the 80s, 90s, but then it didn't seem like technologically feasible. So people stopped talking about it for a while, but then there had been like a lot of development in ocean technology and so on in the meantime, and people started talking about it again. And around that time, like in 2015, is when it started to really pick up, as I understand it, the conversation again on deep sea mining. But it was still sort of early discussions, and it was for most people a very like a little bit like sci-fi, and that was also what fascinated me, because I was also interested at that time in decision theory and theories about how to make choices and decisions under uncertainty. This seemed like, wow, this was like great uncertainty. There were like we didn't know anything about what was happening down there. Some, or at least very little. People talked, I remember, about us knowing more about the surface of the moon than the ocean floor.
Yeah, I mean, people still talk about that.
Yeah. It's become sort of a cliche, maybe, but that I hadn't heard about that before in 2015. So I was like, wow. Yeah, this is just super interesting, and it's all this uncertainty. How are we going to make like good choices in that, facing that kind of uncertainty? So that was sort of the ethics of it was super interesting, but also the more like decision theoretic, epistemic aspects of it was also what drew me to it.
And I guess it's kind of common that you get new ethical questions, especially kind of practical ethical questions, with technological development. Once you get the technological ability to do something new, that brings with it a whole bunch of questions. I mean, I guess we're in the middle of that discussion right now around AI. But yeah, so I guess the technological development kind of opened deep sea mining up to be a possibility. And then suddenly there was all these questions.
Yep.
And it's interesting you talk about the epistemic uncertainty at that point, because I think of deep sea mining now as being just kind of riven with uncertainty.
Yep. Still is.
Yeah, but back then it would have been kind of a more absolute kind of uncertainty, especially in the Norwegian context.
Yeah, it was uncertainty on all levels. Like, would it be possible? Would it be harmful? Would it be beneficial? What are the things we need to know? We didn't even have a full overview of what we needed to know, and also I'm, as a moral philosopher, I'm interested in normative uncertainty. We can get back to that, but there was a lot of that too, and that's also connected to like, do we have like the ethical moral concepts even to talk about these kinds of events? Like, there's so much new stuff going on with it. So yeah.
Okay, and then just briefly, what are you doing now?
Now I'm an associate professor at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences at what's called the HBL Business School at this university. I'm also an associate professor, affiliated associate professor at the business school at NTNU. So again, a little bit accidental that I ended up in this business school environments, but I guess it has to do with my sort of twin interests in environmental ethics, environmental issues, and also issues in economics. And these business schools are really a big thing. There is the concept of sustainability, sustainable development in that space. These like the ethics, like the social aspects, the environment, and the economics are really like what they talk a lot about. So I guess my profile fitted well into that sort of work. So I got these positions there. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm doing research and teaching.
Okay. So then I want to ask you why ethics is important and why it's important to have a moral philosopher, or kind of to approach this from a moral philosophy point. So I came to the deep sea mining question actually kind of very similar to you, only almost a decade later. And for me, I was already working in the scientific research world, and deep sea mining was like a topic. And anytime I went to a conference or a talk or a meeting that had anything to do with deep sea mining, even if it was about the engineering solutions to deep sea mining, I noticed that the conversation was always dominated by these ethical questions. And so I decided to look into the ethical dynamics and how to improve the ethical discussion. And that's what brought me to you as a supervisor. So, yeah. So, why should we have ethicists at the table when talking about deep sea mining?
I think I want to start with talking about normativity more generally. So I think we're all very much, everyone has an interest in normative questions at some level. So we want to know what we should do. What's the best sort of course of action in like all different sorts of domains in our lives, like in our personal lives, in our professional lives, as members of society, and so on. There's always these questions: what should we do? So we have choices between different courses of action, and we wonder, what should we do? And one aspect of that question is, of course, rationality. So what is it rational to do? And that is a question that not only philosophers deal with, but also economists. But it's definitely a normative question. So what is rational to do is like, what should we do given the reasons we have, the evidence we have, the goals we have, etc. So those are normative questions. And as I see ethics, they are sort of a subspecies. Ethical questions are a subspecies of normative questions. So there are questions about what we should do, but not like rationality, as economists conceive of it, at least, is about what you should do given some aim that you have as an agent. That can be like just whatever aim you have, like maximize your utility, maximize your the amount of money on your bank account, right, whatever. So what's special about ethical questions is that they are normative questions, which is not of that type, but about what we should do to respect certain types of considerations that we care about, that are not about like our personal gaining. So, for instance, what we should do to our friends, our family, to people in our society, to people in the global community, how should we act in order to take their sort of interests into account in our actions? So if we're interested in not just our personal gain, what we should do for our personal gain, but for some sort of consideration for others, humans or nature, animals or whatever, then you need ethics. And of course, not only philosophers can do ethics, but what we are trained in is normative thinking and theorizing. That is an essential part of ethics. And that's what I think philosophers can contribute with. So social scientists can also study ethics, but they will typically just study empirical questions like what kind of values do people actually have in a society? What do people think about this and that? What kind of moral considerations are most important to people, and so on? You can ask people that, but you can't investigate empirically what are sort of the best principles, the principles that we should act on, and so on. And those are non-empirical questions, normative questions that needs the kind of thinking and theorizing that philosophers do, I think. Yeah.
Do you feel like people do you feel like people outside of academic philosophy are generally pretty blurry on that distinction? Like even social scientists who deal with the normative aspects of things like this, is it your experience that they're not really clear on this distinction between kind of studying the normative aspects and trying to, I guess, determine the normative aspects?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. That it's the difference between studying them, at least empirically, and sort of trying to determine what they they are or should be. And I think with my students, I spend a lot of time on that sort of distinction. And they have some difficulty in getting it, or at least showing that they get it when they try to apply it. And I think the same thing goes actually for a lot of other researchers and academics in this discussion. So they, at least my impression, this is sort of me generalizing a lot without too much evidence to show for it. But in a lot of papers in ethics that are not written by philosophers, philosophical ethicists, there are a lot of like implicit assumptions about ethics, about normative questions that should, I think, have been more reflected or more put or more explicitly formulated, but they aren't.
But like,
Yeah.
I mean, what's the problem with that? Because I think when you talk to a lot of people, there is kind of this assumption that, okay, different people have different values, and I shouldn't go around questioning someone else's values if they bring, and that we can't avoid having values. We can't avoid bringing our values to our research. And so all we can do at the end of the day is, research within the value systems that we have, or something like that. And then I don't know, maybe there's some kind of just a natural competition between value systems or something once you put all that out there. So what's kind of the issue with this unexamined approach to those values?
I guess it depends on what you're trying to do. So it's no problem having some assumption about values and moral considerations per se as a researcher. And of course, this information about what kind of values people actually have can be super important. But to me, it's more like when researchers are a little bit out of their purely like empirical way of writing, when they're writing like pieces where they're trying to make like policy recommendations. That is where I think some more reflexivity on the normative concepts would be good. So typically in papers about deep sea mining, when people are trying to make some sort of policy recommendations, they can assume things like how this will affect the intrinsic value of nature. That's a concept that pops up quite often. And also things like welfare, human welfare. But these are both concepts that are extremely complex and problematic from a philosophical perspective. So there's no agreement at all about what the intrinsic value of nature, what that even means. And even a like prima facie simple concept like welfare, like human welfare, is just, there's so much discussion and disagreement about what that means. Like you can just take the concept from economists who talks about it as if it's has to do with the preferences people have, like your welfare increases every time your preference is satisfied. But when you put it like that, most people will say that, well, human welfare is not just about having preferences satisfied and so on. So all these concepts, I think when they are employed as if they have like this clear meaning, as if there's no normative stuff going on when we're using those concepts, then I think it is problematic in some way. But I mean, you can just be honest about it and explicit about it, and that's okay. But I mean, it should be pretty obvious that there's at least a need for someone who can try to like clarify what these concepts mean and put some like content into them. And I don't think you can't do that by just doing empirical studies. You can't really figure out what the best concept of intrinsic value, or the right concept of intrinsic value that we should use in decision making, is just by asking people what they think about, or how they use that concept, or how they feel about it, or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me, at least, because it seems even in the like very practical discussions where if you follow the reasoning, you get this value contradiction between human welfare and intrinsic value of nature is very often kind of put front and center in the deep sea mining conversation. But, and a lot of people I think are quite happy to just kind of leave it at that and argue about, you know, human welfare is better or intrinsic value of nature is better and say that the other side is missing a value. But when you try to get into the details and look at the effects of any particular decision, which is going to have to balance and is going to have effects on both of these things, then you start to have to, you start to have to make decisions that are going to affect these things. And then if you don't have definitions about those things, it becomes really difficult to value or to make decisions, I guess.
Yeah. If you want to figure out like what the right decision or policy is, which is, I guess, or assume the point of making like policy recommendations and writing pieces that says something about what politicians or decision makers should do, then as you say, the decisions will have like an effect on human welfare, nature. And if you're not clear about what those concepts are, then I think you want really, it's hard to decide on what the right decision is, what we should do.
Okay, well, this makes me want to ask you what specifically you did with a PhD on the ethics of deep sea mining. Like, which specific questions did you end up focusing on?
Yeah, so I was interested in both in this more classic questions about value. So what sort of values are involved or at stake when we're thinking about deep sea mining? So I did one chapter or paper on a concept that economists use, which is called existence value, which is about the value that we think something can have just by existing. So we don't want to use it for anything, and we don't really even necessarily know too much about it, but we think it's good that it exists in some way. So people think, for instance, or can think that it's good that some species are not extinguished, even though these species or individual organisms or whatever doesn't have any sort of use value for us. So I was interested in that sort of concept, and it's sort of an anthropocentric, human-centered version of the concept of intrinsic value in a way, as I conceptualized it, at least. So it's my interest in that was, so I wanted to see how far you can get with that kind of concept before you sort of run into this more like non-anthropocentric aspects of these value questions.
I like that, especially in the deep sea mining conversation. What sometimes happens with there's this discussion about valuing the ecosystems. And I think it's particularly salient because in a way, it's kind of like the last undisturbed ecosystem. And I think people find an intrinsic value in just knowing that there is a totally natural environment. Although I guess there's still arguments about that because we're starting to have macro effects on the ocean, regardless of actually getting down to these places. But then other people say, well, there's potential future value. Like there's all of these organisms. There might be medical research that can come out of those in the future if we just save them and study them properly. So there's like a more explicit anthropocentric valuing of these things. And you do find that those things just get used interchangeably a lot. People like to switch between saying, well, there's going to be a future use of this, or here's all these potential uses. And then other people are, saying it's valuable whether or not we ever go there. I mean, I think most people never intend to go down to the deep sea, never intend to interact with it, but would still say that they value it.
That's also my impression, that people who haven't reflected too much on this can start by talking about the intrinsic value of nature. And then when they're supposed to justify it, they justify it in a sort of instrumental way that it has value because it's good for people in some sort of way. And that's a sort of, then you're making a sort of category mistake. You're slipping between like two value categories that are fundamentally different.
Yep.
So the intrinsic value concept is supposed to capture the value something has independently of whether it's useful or whatever. So once you start to talking about usefulness, you're sort of in a different category. So when you slip between those, you'll get a sort of confused discussion.
Okay, so that was paper one of your PhD?
Yeah, the second is more about choices, decision making, and it's something you're also interested in. It was about what in the philosophical literature is called hard choices. So it's choices between options where there's no clear like value ranking of the options. So when we want to make rational choices, we need to make comparisons between the choices. We need to know which one is better in some respect than the other, or if they are like equally good in some respects, and so on. But there are types of choices where that sort of comparative judgments are super hard to make. And one example of that from what we've already been talking about is there's values involved that are seen as fundamentally different, and what in the philosophical terminology is called incommensurable. So there's no sort of common measure to compare them with respect to. And that the reason why this intrinsic value concept is an example of that is that, so the common metric that we use to measure human values, like what's called anthropocentric values, is some sort of human welfare measure, or at least some how it affects like concepts such as human rights can be another way to do it. But it's at least the common sort of denominator is the human, like the human, how it affects human life in some way. But this concept about intrinsic value is supposed to, not the value we're talking about here is not about that, at least not as it is conceptualized in environmental philosophy and how it is used there as a sort of fundamentally different kind of category, the type that like Richard Routley was trying to capture in his thought experiment, which is but just about the value of nature independently of human considerations, human use. And when you have these sort of fundamentally different values, and you have to make choices between options where both these types of values can be involved, it's really hard to make comparisons in like what's the best choice to make here, what's like the rational choice to make. But it doesn't have to be like incommensurable values. It can also be something else. It has been discussed a lot what that can be, but just a simple example is if you want to choose between two careers, one as let's say a guitar player and the other as a lawyer, you can find that choice really hard. So you can think that, well, the guitar player career option is good in these respects. The lawyer options is good in those respects. So, for instance, the lawyer option is good in terms of like you get a good salary and so on. The guitar playing option is good because it gives you a sort of outlet for your artistic ambitions or whatever. But you find it really hard to say like this one is better than the other. And the reason is just that there's no like sort of like obvious common value that you can measure these things up against. And the traditional rational choice solution, economist solution to that issue is to just say, well, if none of the options is better than the other, then that means they're equally good. So you can just flip a coin. It doesn't matter. You can just the rational choice could be just any choice. But the thing is that we don't always think that seems right. So we might say, if that's correct, then that means that if I just raise the value a little bit on the one option, then that would tip the scale. So if I just, let's say I'm paid 50 kroners more a year for the lawyer position, that becomes a little bit better, then they're no longer equally good, and I should just choose the lawyer option. But that's like our phenomenology, our like the way we experience that choice doesn't necessarily work that way. And that's why philosophers in this debate say that, well, maybe there's something more like fundamental incomparability going on in these types of options. So we don't need to go into that. It's just the point is that you can get like super complex like structures in your choices, even on that prima facie like simple issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a big one, certainly in the deep sea mining conversation. Like you said, if we accept some form of both value of ecosystems that are potentially going to be destroyed in order to get the minerals, in order to produce human welfare, then the comparison between those things becomes key. And a lot of people would say, well, they're on different scales. We can't compare them.
Yep.
And so we just are forced to kind of make some decision. And then again, when you put that into context, if you say, okay, what if we're looking at, whatever, 500 square kilometers of the seabed in order to have some amount of human welfare? If you say, well, those are fundamentally like of equal abstract value, and then like you say, okay, well, what if we just change the amount a little bit? What if instead of 500 square kilometers, it's now 600 for the exact same amount of human welfare, right? Changing that one variable around, it doesn't solve the problem. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So I think it just shows how super complex these choices can be. So we want it making, I assume, most people assume, to make like rational choices in the sense of reasons-based choices, but it's just super difficult because of these like fundamental difficulties with questions of value. And we can't ignore them either, because value is like just a way of, just a word that we use to just say that, well, things matter to us.
Right.
So we can't get rid of the concept. It's
So it seems to me that in a lot of these ethical questions, they're obviously important and everybody likes to argue about them, but they don't feel really relevant until you add in the details, until you have to make like a specific decision. To me, this is like very relevant to this ideal, non-ideal theory distinction. So I want you to give the listener an intro to ideal and non-ideal theory, and then we can see how it applies to deep sea mining.
Yeah. So there's been this debate going on for a long time it started in political philosophy, which is sort of the area of moral philosophy, which deals with questions of political relevance. For instance, just distributions in society. And there was this hugely influential theories developed in the 1970s, most famously John Rawls's theory of justice, which is like a huge work on how to achieve a just society. What are like the principles of justice? And in the wake of that book, there was a lot of debate about the question that John Rawls, the American political philosopher, himself raised in that work, which was about the relevance of our principles, our moral principles, and more specifically in his discussion, our principles of justice, what relevance they have for real world politics. So you can sort of theorize about what the ideal principle of justice will be. but it might be the case that people will never actually be able to implement or use that principle in any way in real world politics. So what would then be the point of doing that sort of theorizing, that sort of normative political theorizing, if no one would be able to use those principles because of some facts about the real world? So for instance, if your theory, as John Rawls's theory did, assumes that everyone will comply with the principles that you suggest, and if that sort of affects the way you theorize or formulate your principles, then it's relevant to ask, well, what if it's not the case that people in the real world will actually comply to what your principle implies? And that was the beginning of the sort of non-ideal debate. And the first sort of non-ideal theory that people were starting to talk about was a theory of justice where you don't assume that people will actually comply to the principles, that people will just partially comply with what your principles imply of politics, like policy making. And
yeah, so this again, trying to put this in the deep sea mining context, it feels super relevant to the question about the need for resources. So a lot of people say we don't need to go out and, I mean, whether it's deep sea mining or land-based mining, putting that aside, we kind of don't need to deal with this question of environmental harm in order to get more resources, because it's so obvious that we're all using so many more resources than we need. And so we should, like, value-wise, just use less, and that will solve this kind of incommensurable question that we were talking about earlier.
Okay, yeah. So in deep sea mining, that's a good example. So the analogy for deep sea mining would be something like, okay, let's see what kind of principles we should develop for decision making on deep sea mining. And let's see what kind of principles we would get if we assume that people want deplete resources. Like if people will actually use resources in the most efficient and rational way. And then you might get some kind of principles for decision making that will sort of rely on that assumption. And that would be an example of like an ideal theory, because then you abstract away from the fact that people don't always use resources in the most efficient and rational way. So the question here becomes, can you make that kind of assumptions? And it's very, you have a quite similar discussion in economics also. Everyone knows like this assumption that classical economists, neoclassical economists use, that people are rational agents.
Yeah.
But every economist knows that that's not true. So
right,
it's
if you just set up a series of incentives that have the behavior you want be incentivized, then people should act in a rational way. And then you put that in the real world and find out that people very often act against their own self-interest.
So for instance, in the discussion very high on the agenda right now about the effects on the economy of these tariffs that Trump is introducing, then you can say, okay, let's consider this. If everyone is acting rationally on that policy, what will happen? Of course, you will get one type of outcome, and you will get another outcome if people are just completely irrational and doing not what's in their own best interests and so on. And in the same sort of, you get the same sort of issue in moral philosophy and ethics and political philosophy, that if you make these assumptions about agents or about the circumstances, another assumption you can make, for instance, in the deep sea mining case, is that your whatever principle you come up with for decision making on deep sea mining won't matter whether the policy that will be recommended by that principle is feasible or not. So that's called the feasibility constraint. So if you have an ideal theory, you don't need to worry about feasibility at all.
Yeah.
But the objection to that is, well, it seems to matter whether what you're recommending is actually achievable
Yeah. So
or not. Yeah.
there's what you said at first was the compliance question is like, what would be the ideal value, assuming everyone would comply. So that's like, well, the ideal value might be just nobody use more than they need, and then we can stay out of the deep sea. And then we get this like, well, people aren't going to comply with that value. So then you have a policy that says, well, we won't sell anything. We'll make it so that people are only allowed to buy as much as they need. And now we have a policy that is in line with the value solves the compliance problem, but now you've got an implementation problem, what you called not compliance. What was the word?
Partial.
Feasibility. That was the word.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So so the objection to proposing a kind of principle such as, let's say, the principle of decision making in this case is we just use what we need. But then people will object, well, that is not going to happen because that empirically in the real world, that's not how people act. They try to maximize their utility, their self-interest or something. So they will always try to get more than just what they need. And then the non-ideal normative theorist will say, because of this, we have to reject the ideal theory, the ideal principle, and try to find a non-ideal principle, which is a principle that is sensitive to those kinds of facts about the real world. So then you get, like, as Joseph Heath, another theorist that we both read and like, what he calls a second best theory. So it's the first best theory is the one where everyone is just acting rational and correctly and so on, like the ideal world. But since we're not living in the first best world, then we need to have a theory for the second best world. And he even says that, even the second best world might be too ideal, so we need a third best theory. So you get all these layers of like idealization, but at the end, you will just reach what another theorist in this debate, he is called Estlund. He's an American with a Swedish-sounding name. I have forgotten his name. He wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago, which is called Utopophobia. But he argues that, like, in the last instance, the non-ideal theory will just be something which he calls complacent realism.
Right.
Which is just like, well, you can no longer make any sort of normative recommendations because your theory just have to assume that everyone acts as, or the world just is as it is and will always be as it is, and people will just behave as they do and won't change their behavior. So that's also unacceptable, of course, because then you get like you have normative impotence both in the ideal case, because then you propose principles that are just too abstract or ideal. But then you also get normative impotence at the other end of the spectrum because your theory will just be complacent to how the real world is. It doesn't leave any room for like improvement or normative judgments about how to improve.
Right. So then we're all on some kind of a spectrum in between these things. We're trying to develop normative principles, value propositions, decision rules that are improvements over the status quo, but also somehow practical.
Yeah, I think that's where myself and a lot of people think we should be on somewhere along that spectrum. But there are people who argue that ideal theorizing is also valuable, and I think they're right to some extent in that. But I haven't yet met anyone who thinks like complacent realism would be a good way to do normative ethics.
Okay, yeah, well, because it seems to me a lot of people push back against involving philosophers in the debate because of this over idealism. It's like, okay, you guys are off in your ivory towers thinking about what would be the right thing to do, present circumstances accepted, but that's not actually very useful in the present circumstances.
But then you can say that that sort of depends on the debate. So one point that Estlund makes in Utopophobia is that one thing you can want from political philosophy or another of normative theorizing is recommendations about what to do. Another thing you might want from this kind of theory is just the truth about what we should do. Those things might be different. So it might be true that we should not use more resources than we need. That might be sort of a normative truth. That's sort of the correct thing to say about what we should do. But since it's not feasible or whatever, you won't be able to make any sort of real recommendations with that principles. So then you need non-ideal theorizing you need to level down a bit or step down a little bit on a lower level of abstraction if you want to make recommendations.
But maybe it's good to have that ideal goal as a target to aim for,
Yep.
And then you got to get into the messy details on how to get incrementally closer to that target or in the right direction at least.
Exactly. That's what some people have argued that, well, if you don't have these ideal principles, then you don't really know what to aim for. Yeah. So this just give you a sort of ideal to aim for without it being said that you'll ever reach that ideal. But this has actually been discussed at some length by Amartya Sen, the famous Nobel Prize winning economist and philosopher, who has an objection to this where he says something like, well, that might sound intuitively plausible, but if what we want to do in the non-ideal case where we want to make recommendations is to make like comparative judgments between different alternative sort of policies or alternative worlds that we want, it's not always true that these sort of utopian ideals will help us do that.
Yeah, right. If we're trying to make a decision about whether and how to go about regulating deep sea mining in the Norwegian context, having an ideal of we shouldn't use more than we need is arguably not at all useful in the decision at hand.
One aspect of his argument, and I think I'm not sure if I'm convinced by that, but I might be more convinced when he says that it at least doesn't always seem necessary to know what the sort of ideal principles are to make like improvements in our current situation. So he uses this analogy where he says that in order to compare the height of two mountaintops, you don't need to know what the highest mountain in the world is. You just need to see these two situations. So he says that in order to compare two sort of situations or principles of justice or whatever, you don't necessarily need to know what the ideal principle of justice is.
Yeah, I see. So it goes both ways. So on the one hand, knowing the ideal might not be useful in the context, and it also might not actually be necessary. You could make the contextual value judgment without knowing what the ideal would be in that case.
So that's his position, and there are a lot of people disagree with that. My own position, I think, is that this ideal theory and non-ideal theory aren't mutually exclusive or even competitive forms of theorizing. They are like complementary. So I think, and I think he would agree to that at some level, but I think we need ideal principles for some purposes, but they can't get us all the way to like policy recommendations. So then we need to do non-ideal theorizing, and sometimes it can help having like these ideal principles to guide us, but it's not always necessary. So that I agree with Sen on that, but I don't think that shows that we shouldn't do ideal theory, because that doesn't follow from that kind of view.
Okay, so then I guess I've never asked you where you stand on the deep sea mining question. So you were in this public debate you were in this discussion for, I guess, 4 years, and that was a little while ago, and then you kind of drifted out of it. Well, I've tried to pull you back in recently. But did you, during that time, kind of have a stance on the central questions around deep sea mining? And do you still have a stance, or how do you look at it?
I think I started out and proceeded on writing my PhD believing that we could get clear to some extent on the ethics of deep sea mining, that we could make some sort of recommendations. But now I'm not so sure anymore. I become maybe a little bit more pessimistic about it, and the reason is just the total perplexing complexity of these kinds of issues. So I mean, one way to make that point is that even starting with sort of like a quite simple normative framework like cost benefit analysis, which is about choosing the option with the greatest positive balance of benefits over harms or costs. Even that is just extremely complex in these kinds of cases, and very much of it has to do with empirical uncertainty. We need to know a lot to be able to just get the facts straight about what the benefits and the harms will be. So you have this empirical uncertainty, which is something the natural scientists and empirical researchers are trying to reduce. And they do that to some extent. Of course, we gain more knowledge all the time, but it's still, it's just so many things we don't know. I guess you can talk to marine biologists and they will confirm that. But there's also a lot of all this normative uncertainty, which is, if we just take the economics of it, what will be like from the point of view of economics, the best ways to proceed in this area? Not just a high level question like, should we do it or not, but like to what extent we should allow it, or to what extent we should restrict it, and so on. It's just so insanely complex to get the calculations right about like the costs and benefits. Again, even from a purely economic perspective, that even if we don't go all the way to the ethics, we just stop with like the economics. It's just hugely complex, and then you reach like the ethics of it, and it just becomes a total mess. Like, what I mean by that is that you even like things that you could say should be like, it seems at least like achievable, like getting some agreement on some concept of the value of nature that we can use in like our ethical analysis, and what kind of rights are involved, and so on. It's just so extremely complex. Just to be clear about what I'm pessimistic about. So I'm not pessimistic about the ability of ethics to sort of help us map out what the relevant considerations are. I think that's something ethics can do and can be really helpful in doing. And I guess that's part of what I was trying to do in my PhD. But when it comes to this more like non-ideal aspect, like the recommendations aspect, I just find it, I'm much more pessimistic. So I think it's just so hard to know what we can do, and you get the same thing in areas like AI, where there's also these huge complexities and these developments all the time, leaping from one thing to another.
So it's so hard to understand all of the likely consequences of any decision that, so it's like, it's one thing to kind of, I mean, again, to this ideal, non-ideal question, you're saying it's easy enough to, or it's useful anyway, to look at the values involved and to try to ascertain the different values. But when it comes to whether or not these values are achievable and how they become achievable and to what extent there's trade-offs between values and how those will likely happen given any decisions, that level of uncertainty is just too high to make much progress in terms of saying what we should do in context.
Yeah, I guess basically that's what I'm saying. And I realize that there's a risk I'm sort of undermining my own profession here, but I do find, as I said, I think there's a lot of significance in just understanding the ethical issues, and that I guess that can be related to what I talked about a minute ago about like there is some value in just knowing what the truth is about some issues. So I don't want to make too strong assumptions about like moral truths and so on. But but I think it's just a lot of valuable work can be done on that level. But when it comes to these aspirations, which I think is motivating a lot of this non-ideal theory, which is motivated by we also need to make like policy recommendations and so on. I find it much more difficult to be like an optimist on that. I think it's to a very large extent it will have to be left to other types of processes, like some sort of democratic deliberation or something. So we need to.
I mean, that was exactly my question. Is if you kind of say this is too complex for a rational assessment process under whatever methods you can apply to it, then yeah, it's like kind of, well, okay, so what else? What do we do then? Is it that we need to incrementally build up the right kind of knowledge so that we can start to have this non-ideal theory kind of discussion? Or I mean, I interrupted you as you were kind of giving alternatives.
Yeah, I think just to get as much knowledge we can on both like the empirical and the normative conceptual level. That's the sort of first step. But at some point, I think we will need to just accept some form of pluralism, like value pluralism. And in the ideal case, we would have like we could accept like a value pluralism with just the right types of values or the true values or something like that. But I don't think that's possible, feasible to achieve. So I think that's where like this other areas of ethics, I think, come in, like the more empirical social science approaches to ethics come in. So at some point, we will also need to just like try to map out what considerations are out there, like in society, and try to develop some. Maybe that can be sort of a part of a non-ideal theory, just to develop principles for decision making under those types of conditions. I guess to some extent, some political philosophers are already doing that. They're like assuming pluralism, and that it's like what's the best procedure for decision making in that context.
So explain pluralism a little bit more. So pluralism is that different groups of people are going to have different sets of values, and there's not going to be like there's a master value that turns out to be right. It's that for this group of people, certain values are going to be at least values that they hold, and those are going to be perhaps in conflict with some other group of people's values. And the work then is to try to develop society in a way that nobody's values get too stepped on by anybody else's, kind of thing.
That's one form of pluralism that we could call that like the fact of pluralism in society or something like that. That's like an empirical fact about our societies, is that people have a lot of different like fundamental values that sometimes just doesn't they're sort of incommensurate on the practical level of there's no way of having this master value and convincing them that that's the right way to compare their values. But you can also have pluralism on a more philosophical level, so that it's just true that there are all these different types of things that are valuable at the same time.
And some of those things might conflict.
So the opposite view in philosophy would be monism, value monism. So many utilitarian ethicists are value monists. So they think that there's just one value that we should maximize, like happiness or something like that. And other people are pluralists, so they think happiness matters, but also things like freedom, for instance, meaning, and all the other types of dimensions that can be reduced to happiness. But what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the need for like democratic to leave some things to democratic deliberation and those kinds of processes is the fact of like empirical pluralism. So the fact that people actually have these different values. And it's really difficult as a philosopher to sort of accept that, because I mean, people have all kinds of weird values, like views about how the world should be. And it's obvious that you shouldn't, from like a moral point of view, accept all kinds of views that people might have about what's good. So some people might think it's good that they are the only ones who are happy while everyone else is just miserable. They might think that it's good to use violence or to take advantage of people, to systematically lie about everything. Like, it's hard to say that, oh, well, we should just accept all those kinds of views on value. So the middle ground is a lot of theories of deliberate democracy. Two of the most famous ones are, I remember the last names again, only Gutman and Thompson. I'll look up that reference later, but they talk about we should only accept pluralism to the extent that the values are the outcome of like a reasoned public debate. But that again might sound ideal to some people. Like, to what extent is there, like in the US today, a reasoned public debate? It just seems total chaos. There might be like some pockets of American society still being reasonable. That might be controversial to say, but it seems to me that there's a lot of like just irrationality going on.
Yeah, certainly the debate part seems to have broken down. If there are, it could be that there's two sets of pockets or multiple sets of pockets that are being reasonable, but they don't seem to be rationally talking to one another at this point.
No, and they're up against large groups that have their own idiosyncratic ideas, at least, about what is reasonable and rational and so on. So it's a complete mess. So how to deal with that, but to not be like too pessimistic. I think we can, to some extent, sort of compensate for all the irrationality in society if we assume that this exists, by having like rational institutions. So the idea is that you can make institutions that are not as prone to irrationality as individuals, that they have like, they're built on principles, they have like let's say the constitution or something, or parts of constitutional democracy where you have some principles that are just in the law. And it's really hard to, and it's not impossible. Even that is challenged these days in the US, but that you can at least come a long way with having like rationality on the level of institutions, and then you can still accept a lot of irrationality, I think, by individuals, because as long as a lot of the decision making is going on through these institutions, I think you can have a lot of like rational.
So then that's, I mean, again, for the deep sea mining context, that is suggestive of some fairly important roles for, again, non-ideal moral philosophizing, is because there is a need for institutional development. Again, this is a new field. The ISA is famously still developing its regulations. Norway is developing the institutions that are going to regulate a potential deep sea mining industry. So even if you don't specifically know what the right answers are, you can talk rationally about what the right institutions would be that can help kind of hold things together in situations of plurality.
Yeah, I think so. And these institutions can be based on pluralism, but on a sort of more recent type of pluralism. So you build the institutions on values that are at least subject to some sort of constraints. So I think you can get some way in doing that, and that's super important. And it's of course like building institutions is both like it's something our whole society, of course, participates in, but from an academic perspective, it's like an essentially interdisciplinary endeavor. So you need philosophers, you need economists, you need political scientists, you need natural scientists, you need technology. So I guess the philosophy also, or ethics, can quite obviously, as I see it, contribute into that sort of institution building, which would be like, instead of direct policy making recommendations, it would be at least an input on this kind of moral, ethical considerations that these institutions needs to at some level be aligned with. Yeah.
Okay, well, if that isn't if that isn't an optimistic note to end on, it's at least a somewhat practical avenue where we can think about going forward. Yeah. So the wrap up questions. So you've mentioned a number of kind of sources and important philosophers that have been instrumental to some of these questions, but is there anywhere that you would like point people who are interested in this specific question as far as like resources to follow up on?
You mean like references?
Yeah, if I was someone who was interested in the moral, ethical side of the deep sea mining debate, and I listened to this podcast and I thought, oh, these are interesting things. What else can I go and read? Is there anything that you can point to as kind of like a good starting?
In all like humbleness, I think you could get something out of my PhD. And in fact, I mean, even though that isn't, I won't say that's sort of an ideally great work in philosophy or anything, but there's just not a lot of work that has been done on the philosophy of deep sea mining.
Yep.
Other than that, I think there's a lot on the ethics, but ethics in very much from the what I've called more like the empirical side of it. So there's people writing on the ethics of deep sea mining all the time, but not from the point of view of philosophical ethics, I think. So it will be my PhD and your future PhD, and that's it.
Great. And then, yeah, so I'll put links in the show notes to everything that we mentioned and also to where people can find your papers on the topic. And then is there anywhere that listeners who are interested in what you're doing can follow you or get in touch with you if they've got questions?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is just my employee website at NTNU or HVL.
You're not super active on social media?
No, I'm on ResearchGate, but then you need to be a member of ResearchGate. So if you're a member of that, you can go there. But I'm not on any like Instagram or I have a Facebook profile which I have posted some things on, but
I noticed just today that you're on LinkedIn, but
I don't use it. I'm not
I
active.
didn't notice any posts there.
not an active LinkedIn user, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for taking the time to do this with me.
Thanks for having me.